talk about these circuits that blood has to go through in order for gas exchange, transport, etc. So the pulmonary circuit we described, this is supplied by the right side of the heart, blood leaving the right ventricle specifically, going out to the lungs, and then from the lungs coming back to the left atrium specifically. So that constitutes the pulmonary circuit. And remember, the purpose of the pulmonary circuit is to have exchange across the pulmonary capillaries. We also have the systemic circuit. This is supplied by the left heart, left ventricle specifically, to the tissues and cells throughout the body, the systemic tissues. And then from there, they come back to the heart, to the right atrium specifically, and the circuit goes over and over and over in that sort of cyclical fashion. Now, blood is going to move through series when we think about the entire cardiovascular system. So when blood leaves the heart, all of it has to go to the lungs. Okay, there's no option here. We have to have gas exchange. And so all the blood leaving the right ventricle must go to the pulmonary circuit. All of it must come back to the heart, and all of it must go out into the systemic circuit. So in that way, blood is flowing in a series. It has to take one stop, then the other, and then back, right? That series fashion. When we think about blood individually within the pulmonary circuit or even within the systemic circuit, blood that's flowing individually to these circuits is now flowing in parallel. And what does that mean? When we leave the heart and we're now in the systemic circuit, all of the blood does not go to every single organ or every single tissue. Blood is flowing in parallel here. So some blood goes to the brain. All right, some will go to the upper extremities. Some of it will go to the abdomen. Some of it will go to the kidneys, liver, etc. So when we are looking at the circuits individually, blood is flowing in parallel. It has an option. But when we're looking at it more holistically at both circuits, blood is flowing in series. Okay, so let's describe that a bit further here. So when blood leaves the lungs, where it is picking up oxygen, so oxygenation happens here, all of that blood has to go back to the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. All of it has to go out to the body, and all of it has to come back to the heart. And so when we think about the heart, lungs, heart, body, blood is flowing in series in this instance. All of the blood has to flow in this series, and it has to stop at one place to the next, etc. When we look at the circuits individually, so if we take the pulmonary circuit individually, all of the blood does not go to the left lung and then all of it goes to the right. That is not how it flows within the specific circulatory unit. Here, some of the blood goes to the left lung and some of it goes to the right. So within the pulmonary circulation, blood is now flowing parallelly. It's now taking an option where some of it can go left and some of it can go right. Similarly, in the systemic circulation, some percent goes to the liver, some percent goes to the kidneys, and some percent goes to the bladder, limbs, etc. And it can be flowing in parallel in the systemic circulation as well. Okay, so very important to be able to differentiate when blood is flowing in series, where it has to stop at every single point, versus when it is flowing in parallel, where now it has a percentage that is distributed across different tissues within the systemic and pulmonary circulation. Okay. So just describing that series flow here a bit more. Series means that this is a closed system. So blood is not leaving at any point. All of your blood stays within your vessels and your heart. And so this is constituting a closed system, unless of course you have a major source of bleeding, right? And then blood is actually leaving the vessel and being bled out from your body. Then that would be an open system. But for normal physiologic function, that is not so. And so this is a closed system. So blood flowing through the systemic and pulmonary circuits is in series, in that all of the blood must go through both circuits in sequence and then go back to its starting point, right? There's no option within that overall systemic circuit, overall circulation. And then just to talk about parallel flow here, again, the option that blood can take, and that option is going to depend on your state, right? Your physiologic state, whether or not you're exercising, whether or not you're resting and digesting, the state of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. So this is how we can shunt blood depending on demand. If you're running a marathon, guess what? Your skeletal muscles, they need more flow. So we can increase the flow towards the skeletal muscle and divert that away from other structures like the GI tract and maybe the skin, right? Shunt that blood away from those organs and towards organs that have a higher demand. So this is why it's important to understand the parallel flow, is that these organs are regulated independently, and there's an option as to where blood can flow, and more specifically, how much of that blood can flow to these various organs. Okay. Let's think about the coronary circulation. So because the heart is, I usually refer to this as the heart being very selfish. It just takes its own supply to supply its muscles, its chambers, its valves. It's going to take that right from the aorta at the base of the ascending aorta leading to the arch. So there are two coronary arteries, the left coronary artery, the right coronary artery, and several different coronary branches that are actually running on the outside of the heart within the fat that's found on the heart itself and are helping to supply the heart chambers and muscles, etc. So the heart has its own supply. It does not take oxygen from the blood within its chambers. It actually has vessels that are on the outside of the heart that will supply its nutrients and oxygen. And this can be considered a parallel example. So this is one of the options that blood takes. This is one of the parallel routes of blood because it is just as important as any other organ system. In fact, it's more so important as its overall function is ejection of blood, right? Very, very essential to the functioning of most other organs. Let's think about the location of the heart anatomically. So it is in the thoracic cavity. It's centered in the middle, but it's skewed towards the left, especially the apex of the heart. Okay, so it's not sort of smack in the middle. It's really shifted or pointed towards the left. It is separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm. So it sits on top of the diaphragm. And it's usually the size of your fist, right? Proportionally. So if you're larger, you have a larger hand, a larger fist, you also have a larger heart. In that instance, females will typically have a smaller heart than males. It weighs about 250 to 350 grams, and it is covered externally by a layer called the pericardium. And the pericardium does two things. It helps to surround the heart as a form of protection. It's very thick, the outer pericardium, but it also helps because there's a small amount of fluid inside that helps to lubricate the heart and decrease any friction as the chambers contract and relax. Okay, so the pericardium, which is external to the heart, this layer about here, is essential to the overall functioning of the heart. It helps to maintain a little bit of the pressure on the chambers as well to help them eject blood efficiently and effectively. Let's look at the heart internally and the layers of the heart. So there's epicardium, which is the outermost external membrane. That is actually one and the same pericardium that we just described. Okay, so the pericardium, it's like two sides of the same coin. The inner layer is the epicardium. The outer layer is the pericardium, right? The outer covering on top of the heart, the external membrane of the heart. The myocardium is the middle of the heart, the muscle, the thick part of the heart, especially when you look at the ventricles. The left ventricle specifically has a very thick myocardium, and you can see that ventricular wall being much thicker than that on the right side. And the reason for this is because the left ventricle ejects blood against the resistance that's found in the systemic circulation. So it has to work harder to overcome that resistance, and so it develops a thicker muscle. On the right ventricle, the right side, the resistance of the pulmonary circulation is it's much smaller, it's much lower. And so the right ventricle does not have to work as hard to pump blood against the resistance in the pulmonary circulation. So that's just one reason why there's a discrepancy in the thickness of the myocardium. The endothelium is the inner lining. So this is the layer of endothelial cells that is internally covering the chambers. And so when you think about these three layers, the heart is really just a large, complex blood vessel, right? Any other blood vessel that you look at would have these layers as well. The epithelial layer above, the middle layer, which is the muscle, and then the endothelial layer inside. And so the heart starts as a single tube if you look at the development of the heart. And so it really just becomes this fancy, complex, elaborate vessel. All right, let's think about the vessels here. We introduced some of the vessels earlier, but let's talk about their location and their function. So because we have pressure within the chambers, remember the chambers are muscle, and so when they contract, they exert pressure on the blood in the chamber, which is what is moving the blood around, right? So the difference in pressure is what allows blood to flow from one chamber to the next, right? If we have high pressure in the left atrium and low pressure in the left ventricle, blood is going to move according to that gradient from high to low pressure. And so the valves are passive structures. The valves are not muscular. The valves are really fibrous or fibrous skeleton and then connective tissue. So there's no muscle in the valve to move it out of the way. The pressure gradient that is created is what allows the normal direction of flow. This is why blood goes from atria to ventricle, because the atria contract first, which means higher pressure in the atria. And now blood is going to go from high pressure to low pressure. So it moves from atria down into the ventricle. And then the ventricle contracts, again, high pressure in the ventricle, lower pressure in the arteries. And so blood is going to move from high to low pressure according to that gradient and go from the ventricle out into the artery. So whenever blood is moving past these valves, it is doing so because of the passive movement based on the pressure gradient, the difference in pressure from high to low. Okay, and so we can see that in the example here again. So when this chamber contracts, there's now a higher pressure here than in the vessel, in the artery. So the valve simply opens up because of that pressure, passively opens up because of that pressure. Now, on the right side of the heart, we have the AV valve. The tricuspid valve is the right AV valve. The bicuspid valve is the left AV valve. The bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve, just because it looks like the mitre, the bishop's hat, or almost like the chess piece, the bishop, if you play chess. So that shape is where it gets its name, the mitral valve. It also has two cusps. So unlike the right side of the heart, it has two cusps. And just to explain the functional relation to that, the reason that it has an extra cusp on the right is because there's more volume coming back on the right. So the right side of the heart is more suited for volume. It's a lot of blood coming back from the systemic circulation. And so there needs to be an additional leaflet on that valve just to help to secure those chambers from that additional volume. So one thing to remember as we describe all of these specific features, the left side of the heart is more suited for pressure. Higher pressure pumps against higher resistance, has a thicker muscle. The right side of the heart is more suited for volume, which is coming back from the systemic circulation. All right. There are also papillary muscles and chorda tendineae. So what are these two structures? The papillary muscles are the finger-like projections that are sticking up from the wall of the ventricle specifically. So they're not found in the atria, they're only found in the ventricle. And the papillary muscles help to anchor from the wall of the ventricle to the valve. And they do that by way of the chorda tendineae. So here's the papillary muscle, and then here's the chorda tendineae, and then here is the valve. And what this does is allows for the contraction of the ventricle to be attached to the anchoring of the valves. So whenever the valve is open, the ventricle is relaxed, the chorda tendineae are sort of loose and floppy, and the valve is open and blood can move from the atria down into the ventricle, right? The ventricle is relaxed here. On the other end, when the valve is closed and the ventricle has begun contracting to eject that blood out into the artery, now we need to secure the AV valve. This is helping to prevent blood from going back into the atria. So while the ventricle contracts, the papillary muscles will also contract because they're attached, and then the chorda tendineae will become more tense or more taut, and they'll sort of anchor down based upon that contraction of the muscle and help to lock the valve in place and prevent the valve from collapsing, okay? So that is what helps to prevent any relapse or regurg of blood while the chamber is contracting back into the atria. Instead, it allows for that blood to only go out into the artery. Okay, so it prevents the AV valves from collapsing. The semilunar valves on the other end are found between the ventricle and the artery. So the aortic valve on the left heart between the left ventricle and the aorta versus the pulmonary valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. And the pulmonary valves are not associated with the chorda tendineae. They're not associated with the papillary muscle. And what helps to prevent prolapse of these valves is their semilunar nature. So the blood that is leaving the chamber goes out into the vessel, right, and starts moving out into the circulation. And then when that valve closes, again, because of the pressure gradient, when the pressure in the ventricle drops, there's no longer a high to low, so the valve closes passively. And then blood just hits back against the semilunar cusps of these valves, and that is what prevents any prolapse in the semilunar valves. Okay, and there's less likely to be prolapse here simply because the pressure gradient is lost when the ventricle relaxes, and then blood is actually moving out into the circulation. So it's not going to be coming back unless you have a stenosis or some type of pathology happening. Okay, and a stenosis is a narrowing of the vessel, right? If you have a narrowed vessel or you have plaque in the arteries, then you may have some resistance, some backlog of blood, and that's where you can get things like heart failure. You can get enlargement of the heart, etc. And that gets a little bit more complex. But normally, blood is usually going out into the vessels and not backlogging into the